If you're going for that hardcore, old school, normally aspirated look, or actually performance, nothing beats a tunnel ram. Stack injection is good. Stack injection is cool, but it's expensive, it's exotic, they're very finicky to deal with, especially the mechanical ones. The later EFI ones aren't so bad, but stack injection is its own kind of thing. The tunnel ram, on the other hand, is infinitely practical if you don't mind things sticking out of your hood. They're flexible, they work great on street cars, they work great mid-range. The perfect example of that is my friend Andy Wood's truck, Casper, that runs a 394-inch Ford motor. It's got a tunnel ram on it with a pair of Hollies. It runs 1150s in the quarter mile, 1140s in the quarter mile, and you get 16 miles to the gallon on the highway with it, because these things can be incredibly efficient. How do they work? So, ram, tunnel ram, right? It's cross ram, ram induction, the Rochester ram jet. All of these manifolds work on the principle of sonic pulses. So, in essence, we covered this in a video on the Sonoramic, the Chrysler cross ram cars, but just a quick refresher. The way it works is that when the intake valve is open and the column of air is moving down the runner here, it flows, the intake valve closes, it stops, and there's a sonic pulse that heads back up the runner. The length of the runner dictates at what RPM it tunes at. The longer the runner, the lower the RPM that it tunes at, and the shorter the runner, the higher the RPM. And obviously there are differences in diameter that would affect length and so on and so forth, but the principle is that the column meets the closed intake valve. It sends a sonic pulse back up the runner. It gets to the plenum, and it reverses itself and starts heading back towards the valve again. If the length is right, that column will meet the valve as it's opening again, and you get a ram effect. That's the whole thing. That's where the ram in tunnel ram comes from. And it works. But the history of these things, they have a colorful history. So, like Mopar guys like to pride themselves on the fact that the High and Mighty, which was a Ram Chargers, was Chrysler engineer factory team car. It was their test bed. The High and Mighty was a C-altered car, had the first successful functional tunnel ram setup. And this is in 1959. Now remember, in the 1950s, all of the engineers, all of the manufacturers were looking at sonic tuning. All of the manufacturers were working with that ram induction setup. And the first to actually put it into production was General Motors with the Rochester Ramjet. That was the mechanical fuel injection setup that they started using in 1957. So the Ramjet, the actual manifold itself looks exactly like this and has runners almost identical to this. But instead of having the carburetors and a plenum here, it has the air intake on one side and has the fuel metering device on the other side. So that was the first production use of ram tuning, ram induction. Chrysler, the Ram Chargers, had the first racing use of it. Now the Ram Charger manifold on the High and Mighty consisted of, it's just a thing of beauty, it's primitive beauty. Consisted of a pair of flanges that bolted to the Hemi heads. They used a 354 Hemi in this thing. Pair of flanges, and then from the flanges they had radiator hoses, actual radiator hose clamped at either end that came up like this and fed into a giant rectangular plenum. And then on top of that plenum were a pair of Carter AFPs. The radiator hoses were done for, obviously casting up an experimental intake manifold just to go have, some kicks at the drag strip wasn't in the cards. So they took what they were learning about ram induction and applied it in a way that they could fabricate it quickly and then play with the lengths. So, you could add longer and shorter hoses to make it work. That whole setup was held in place with braces made, I believe they were made out of angle iron that held the plenum and sort of, in other words, the manifold would have been doing like this. It was successful, it worked. Pontiac, now in 1963 you had a couple of things going on. Pontiac, for the 421 Super Duty, had what they called the bathtub intake. The bathtub intake was almost identical. Actually it looks exactly like this, only it's shorter. It's probably, I don't know, I'd say about yay high compared to this. But it looks exactly like this, and they call it a bathtub because the bottom of it, actually, the bottom of the bathtub intake manifold is almost identical to the Rochester ramjet fuel injection manifold. We'll talk about that in 1 second. So the bathtub intake manifold, the Pontiac used on those engines, had a bolt-on plenum. It was just a big open plenum, and it used a pair of AFBs. And again, it had to be shorter because it had to fit under the stock hood. So you couldn't actually have something like this. But they were working with that principle. The neat thing about the Pontiac bathtubs was there were fuel distribution issues with it, and they didn't idle cleanly. Their off-idle response was just sloppy. So what they did was they closed the carburetors down completely, the two outboard carburetors completely, and added a third carburetor in the center. So the one that they added in the center was, there were two versions of this. There was one that used one of the single barrel carburetors from a Corvair that just bolted right here, and that's what you idled off of and low speed drive around. You ran off of this. It was only when you opened it you brought in the outboard carburetors. And then the second version of that also used a Corvair carburetor, but it used the side draft carb off of the Corvair turbo. And that had an adapter that came off of here, and it just hung the carburetor out to the side. It was a little more easy to work with because with that center mounted carburetor, things were kind of jammed in there. The manifold worked, the cars ran really hard. At the same time, there was a guy, I believe his name was Ridgway, who had started taking the old ramjet manifolds, Chevy ramjet manifolds, and modifying them so that they pulled all of the fuel injection stuff off. You ended up with the same basic base as this, and he built carburetor tops for them and started running those. And they were successful. There were classes where you couldn't use fuel injection. The hotter classes, you could use fuel injection, like the gas classes and so on and so forth. But there were a lot of places where you had to use carburation, depending on the class, the sanctioning body. So now let's fast forward. 1968. Super stock cars, or quicker super stock cars, the ABC cars, started running heads-up match races. And they were basically heads-up super stock. And the only real rule with those cars was that they had to say, okay, you had to stick with the basic idea of the super stock car, as far as the rules go, and as far as the engine goes, carburation. As long as it had a carburetor, it didn't really matter if it was an original intake manifold or anything like that. The 1968 super stock Hemi Darts and Cudas, which had the factory cross ram on it, pretty much owned the heads-up super stock classes. To give the Chevy and Fords an edge, or at least put them on parity, Edelbrock released a tunnel ram, the very first tunnel ram. It looked very similar to this. It had a big boxy plenum, had slightly shorter runners, and all of a sudden in these heads-up super stock classes, the Chevys, the big block Chevys, even the small block Chevys, could run with the Hemis and all be within the rules, the spirit of heads-up super stock. 1970, it became crazy popular, and it was big with street racers. A lot of street racers were in the whole heads-up super stock thing in 1969. It was so popular that in 1970, the NHRA adopted it and called it Pro Stock. And once it became Pro Stock, well, everything. The tunnel ram became the defining jewel of the Pro Stock car. There were a lot of variations. Now, this was a street manifold, or street style manifold. The race manifolds had bigger plenums, and they had the footprint for the Dominator, where these take the normal AFB or Holly footprint. Some of them, like if you look at the experimental years, like the Genesis years of like 1970, some of them had huge plenums. They had runners about this long, but the plenums would be up like this. There was a lot of experimentation. There was a lot of evolution that went on during this period of time, and Street guys always want to emulate what the race car guys are doing. So the pro stock cars in the magazines have tunnel rams. Well, if you're going to have a hot street freak, hot street machine, well, you got to have a tunnel ram too. So these things sold like crazy in the early 70s. You couldn't go to a street race or a cruise night or a street night at the Driggs without a sea of tunnel rams. They were everywhere, and they worked really well. They got a bad reputation because a lot of the guys who just automatically plugged a tunnel ram down in their car didn't bother to science them out. They just, well, I'll just take my tunnel ram and put it on my stock 283 with a pair of 750s mounted sideways and I go hit the cruise night. So a lot, I remember very, very distinctly, because I was around in these days, that like tunnel ram cars had a terrible reputation because of the people, the mentality of the guys that were bolting them on. But the people who knew actually how to make them work and spent that little extra time were really unstoppable. So that was the original evolution of the tunnel ram. The cast manifolds were popular in the racing classes until, I want to say, around 1980 or so, and then the sheet metal manifolds started to come in. And there was so much science in these sheet metal manifolds. It was really where all of the horsepower gains were being made in pro stock. I mean, there was probably the difference between the best cast manifold and the sheet metal manifolds that started to evolve in the early 1980s was probably 100 horsepower just in the manifold design. Racers were so over the top with their intake manifolds, pro stock racers, that Bob Glidden had a crash in 1986. Right? And this was on TV. There's video of this if you go looking for it on YouTube. These guys were so wrapped up over their intake manifolds, he crashed his car. It was a full-on crash. It wasn't just bouncing off the guardrail. Before the safety safari gets there, before the film crews gets there, he gets out of the car, rips his fire jacket off, and covers the intake manifold so nobody would see it. I mean, that was, beginning in the middle 1980s, about that same time, these things kind of fell out of favor with the streetcar guys. That movement sort of moved on. And at that same period of time, the manufacturers, now with port injection, were able to employ that whole ram effect deal, like for instance the TPI Chevy, which was very much exactly like this. So instead of the runners coming up like this, the runners come up and like this into the plenum. And they had port injection so that you could do pretty much anything you wanted with the runners and the plenum areas to tune them and so on and so forth. And then today, like literally everything performance oriented, forget performance oriented, everything produced since the middle 1980s has used port injection, some form of port injection, and crazy long runner manifolds. Because it doesn't matter if it's straight or if it's curved or if it's, actually there are advantages to having it curved, but that's another video for another. So today it's just normal. Everything today has long runners and basically the same science that created the tunnel ramp. So that's it. A quick rundown in history on the tunnel ramp. It's everybody's favorite intake manifold, everybody's favorite induction system. Well, maybe blowers or but that's another place. This one over here is going on the slag hammer. It's a low deck Chrysler, so it's going to go on our 3D3. And we'll mount a pair of 600s on here, and then hopefully we can tune the thing to get it to run as cleanly and get the kind of gas mileage that Andy's gets. So, but that's yet to be seen. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.